Cab drivers have witnessed the most disturbing events on the streets of Mexico. Some have picked up passengers who disappear in the middle of the ride. Others have entered areas where reality seems to distort. Today you will learn 4 true stories that will make you hesitate the next time you get into a cab at night. Story 1. The taxi driver had been working the night shift for years, but there was something about tonight that felt different. The streets were eerily empty, and the dim glow of the streetlights barely cut through the dense fog creeping in from the alleys. He sighed, rubbing his eyes, when suddenly a man stepped out from the shadows and raised a hand. His clothes were dark and soaked, as if he had been caught in the rain, yet the pavement was dry. The driver hesitated for a second before pulling over. "Where to?" he asked, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. The passenger slid into the back seat without a word, his face obscured by the shadows. Finally, in a low, raspy voice, he murmured an address. The driver frowned. It was a neighborhood he usually avoided. Dangerous, unpredictable. But a fare was a fare, and he needed the money. As he pulled away from the curb, he stole a glance at the man through the rearview mirror. The stranger sat stiffly, hands resting on his knees, his gaze locked straight ahead. Something about his stillness made the driver uneasy. "You sure about that address?" he asked, trying to break the silence. The passenger didn't respond, just nodded slowly. Minutes passed. The only sounds in the car were the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. The driver tapped his fingers against the wheel, forcing himself to focus on the road. Then, something caught his attention. The man wasn't wearing a seatbelt. The driver considered saying something, but his unease stopped him. Instead, he kept driving, the city growing darker and more desolate as they neared the destination. A few blocks ahead, a police checkpoint appeared, its bright flashing lights casting eerie reflections on the windshield. The driver cursed under his breath. He didn't want trouble, and getting stopped here could mean questions. Questions he didn't have answers for. "Better buckle up, man," he muttered, more out of habit than concern. Still, no response. He looked in the mirror again, and his blood turned to ice. The seatbelt was fastened across the man's chest. The driver gripped the steering wheel tighter. He hadn't heard the click. He hadn't seen the man move. His mind raced to find a logical explanation, but none came. The air in the car suddenly felt heavier, colder. As they passed the checkpoint, the officer waved them through without a second glance. The driver let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned back to speak to the passenger, half expecting to see him sitting just as rigid as before. But the back seat was empty. The seatbelt lay fastened, perfectly in place, stretched across the vacant seat. The driver slammed on the brakes, his pulse hammering in his ears. He twisted in his seat, eyes darting around the back of the car, expecting, hoping, to find some trace of the man who had been there just moments ago. Nothing. Only the faint impression of where he had been sitting, and the lingering chill in the air. The driver shivered, his breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. He turned back to the road, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands. The street was empty, stretching ahead like an endless tunnel. Without another word, he threw the car into gear and sped away, unwilling to spend another second in that spot. He never drove that route again. Story 2. The rain had been falling relentlessly for hours, turning the city streets into rivers of shimmering black. The taxi driver had been working since sunset, and exhaustion was starting to settle in. The windshield wipers struggled against the downpour, barely keeping up with the sheets of rain that blurred the road ahead. It was late, too late for anyone to be out on foot in this kind of weather. Yet, as he drove down a deserted stretch of highway on the outskirts of town, a figure emerged from the darkness, standing by the roadside, soaked to the bone. He almost didn't see her at first, just the faint outline of a woman illuminated by the headlights, one hand raised in a silent request for a ride. He slowed the car and pulled over, glancing at her through the passenger window. Her hair clung to her face, her clothes heavy with rainwater. Without a word, she opened the door and slipped into the back seat. "Where to?" he asked, adjusting the mirror to get a better look at her. She mumbled an address, barely above a whisper. It wasn't far, just a few miles down the road. The driver hesitated for a moment. Something about her felt off. She was shivering, but she didn't try to warm herself. She didn't wring out her clothes, didn't fumble with the seatbelt. Just sat there, motionless, staring straight ahead. He shrugged off the feeling and started driving. The rain drummed against the roof, the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the empty road. He kept stealing glances at her through the rearview mirror, but she never met his gaze. The silence was thick, pressing. Normally, he would make conversation, ask about the night, but something in him told him not to. As they neared the address she had given, the neighborhood grew quieter, older. The streetlights flickered as if struggling to stay lit. Finally, he pulled up in front of a small, worn-down house. The porch light was off, and the windows were dark. The driver turned around to let her know they had arrived. The back seat was empty. His heart lurched. He blinked, his mind racing. He had heard the door close when she got in. He had felt her presence the entire drive. But now, there was no trace of her, except for the seat. It was wet, as if someone had been sitting there, dripping rainwater onto the upholstery. The driver swallowed hard. His fingers felt cold as he reached for the door handle and stepped out into the rain. He hesitated before approaching the house, his feet heavy against the slick pavement. He knocked once, then twice. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing an old man wrapped in a thick sweater, his face lined with age and something deeper, sadness, maybe. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice weary. The driver cleared his throat. "I just dropped off a woman here. She was soaking wet, but she's gone now. I thought maybe she ran inside." The old man's face changed, his expression tightening. He looked past the driver, out into the rain, then let out a long sigh. "You must be mistaken," he said quietly. "My daughter died years ago." The driver felt a chill creep up his spine. "What?" The old man nodded toward the road. "She died in a car accident. Right on that highway. A rainy night, just like this one." The words sent a wave of cold through the driver's veins. He turned back to his car, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The back seat was still wet. Without another word, he climbed into the taxi and drove off, his hands trembling against the wheel. He never took that road again. Story 3. The taxi driver pulled up to the central bus station, the neon lights flickering against the wet pavement. It was a quiet night, the kind where the city felt like a ghost town. He had been driving for hours, restless and eager to finish his shift. Just one more fare, he told himself. A man stood alone near the entrance, hands in the pockets of his long coat, his face shadowed under the dim station lights. As soon as the taxi stopped, he stepped forward and got in without hesitation. "Where to?" the driver asked, adjusting the rearview mirror to get a better look at his passenger. The man gave him an address on the outskirts of town, a place the driver didn't recognize. He pulled out of the station, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. The man sat in the back, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp, watching the world slip by outside. "You've been driving for a long time," the man said after a moment. The driver frowned. "Yeah, I guess. Since you were 22, right?" The driver's hands stiffened around the wheel. He hadn't told him that. Maybe it was just a lucky guess. "You like the night shift," the man continued, his voice calm, almost knowing. "Not too much traffic. Fewer people. But sometimes, it gets lonely." A shiver crawled up the driver's spine. He swallowed hard, forcing a chuckle. "You could say that." Silence settled between them again. The driver kept his eyes on the road, gripping the wheel tighter. There was something unsettling about the way the man spoke, the way he seemed to know things he shouldn't. "You don't visit your mother's grave often," the man murmured. "Why is that?" The driver's heart nearly stopped. His breath hitched, his mind racing. "What did you just say?" The man didn't answer. He simply stared ahead, his expression unreadable. A cold sweat broke out on the driver's forehead. He hadn't mentioned his mother. He hadn't told a soul that he avoided visiting her grave, that guilt had kept him away. There was no way this stranger could know. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the streetlights flickering as they passed. The driver's pulse pounded in his ears. Then, without warning, the man shifted in his seat. "Stop here," he said. The driver blinked, snapping out of his daze. "What? We're in the middle of nowhere. Just stop." The driver hesitated but obeyed, pulling the taxi over to the side of the empty road. He turned slightly, his nerves fraying at the edges. "Are you sure this is?" The back seat was empty. The driver's stomach dropped. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as he scanned the area. The door hadn't opened. He hadn't heard a sound. And yet, the man was gone. A cold chill seeped into his bones. He turned back around, his hands shaking as he reached for the gear shift. Then he saw it. Lying on the seat where the man had been sitting was a bus ticket. His fingers trembled as he picked it up. The paper felt old, the ink slightly faded. He read the details, his vision blurring as his eyes reached the date. It was tomorrow's date. And under it, his own name. The taxi driver felt the world tilt around him. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. His breath came in ragged, shallow bursts. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless. He crushed the ticket in his fist, threw the car into drive, and sped away, refusing to look in the mirror. He didn't want to see if someone was still sitting in the back seat. Story 4. The taxi driver had been half asleep when the call came through. His shift was nearly over, and he had been considering heading home, but the extra fare was tempting. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, giving him the details. A pickup in a small town on the outskirts, far from the city lights. He hesitated but eventually agreed. A job was a job. The road stretched endlessly into the darkness, winding through silent fields and clusters of trees. The further he drove, the more isolated the landscape became. The streetlights disappeared entirely, leaving only the headlights cutting through the thick fog rolling across the road. His fingers drummed against the wheel as the unease settled deep in his chest. When he finally arrived, the town was nearly lifeless. A handful of old houses stood in silence, their windows dark. The only sign of life was a figure standing near the edge of the road. An old man, dressed in an outdated suit, his posture straight, as if he had been waiting for this moment. The driver rolled down the window slightly. "Are you the one who called?" The man nodded and got into the back seat without a word. His presence carried a strange weight, something that pressed against the driver's nerves. "Where to?" he asked. The old man gave him an address within the same town, just a few streets away. The driver glanced at the GPS, but before he could start navigating, the signal cut out. The screen flickered, then turned black. He tapped it, but nothing happened. Annoyed, he turned on the radio to break the silence, but instead of music, only static filled the car. He twisted the dial, but the sound only grew louder, crackling and distorting, as if something were whispering beneath the noise. The old man sat completely still. The driver swallowed hard and focused on the road. The streets were eerily empty, the houses blending into the fog. As they passed under a single flickering streetlight, he risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The old man was staring straight ahead, his face emotionless. The driver cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. "Not many people out this late, huh?" No response. The air felt heavier now, thick like water pressing against his skin. His hands tightened on the wheel. He wanted this ride to be over. Finally, he pulled up to the address. The house was old, its wooden frame barely holding together. The windows were dark, lifeless. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for years. The old man reached for the door and stepped out. The driver watched him move slowly toward the house. Then he noticed something that made his blood turn to ice. The old man passed by the car's window, but his reflection never appeared in the glass. The driver's breath hitched. His chest tightened. His mind screamed at him to drive away, to leave this place behind, but his body refused to move. The old man walked up the creaking steps of the house and disappeared inside without ever opening the door. The driver's hands were shaking as he shifted into drive and sped away. The moment he crossed the town's edge, the radio came back to life, music playing as if nothing had ever been wrong. The GPS flickered back on. The normal world had returned. The next morning, still rattled by the experience, he told a group of locals what had happened. Their expressions darkened. One of them shook his head. "You're not the first," an older man muttered. "That man died years ago. But every time a new driver comes to town, he calls for a ride home." The driver never returned to that town again. Which of these stories chilled you the most? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more creepy stories like these, check out this other video I'll leave you here on screen. But be careful, maybe someone else is watching it with you and you didn't realize it.